Right, a bit about the history of pargeting. If you go back in a long way in history, the Romans did the same techniques, pretty much the same materials in ancient Rome. And then it got forgotten until the Renaissance in the 15th century. And people like Raphael and his mates were digging up the ruins of ancient Rome, and they rediscovered the old pargeting and recreated the technique. So that's when it sort of kicked off again, sort of 14 something or other. And it was really high fashion. Every pope and king in the Christendom wanted pargeting. And Henry VIII was the man who brought it to London, to England. He brought Italian plasterers over to parget his new palace called Nonsuch Palace. It's long gone, sadly, but there are pictures of it, etchings of it, and there are some small remains left, which are stored in the Museum of London. And you can still go to Nonsuch Palace, but it's pretty much a field now. It was really ornate. There were three-dimensional figures of goddesses and nymphs and sprites and things, all round the outside, sort of 8 foot tall and really bold. And there was inner courtyards with pargeting on them too. It must have been really, well, pretty gaudy for our sort of looking. But anyhow, he brought it to England. And then the nobles all went for this thing, and quite quickly English plasterers took on the trade. So by the time you get to plastering in stately homes, it's by top quality English plasterers, and they did things like ceilings and overmantels. So you get sort of Tudor, Jacobean, grand stately homes. You can look up and see the sort of grand version of pargeting. And then at the same time, you know, your merchant or fairly wealthy farmer who was building a nice new house because the country was getting rich, they thought they'd have this lovely ornamental stuff too. So they commissioned their local plasterers to do the same sort of thing, ornamental plasterwork on the outside of their buildings and also on the inside, sometimes on the ceilings. And at some point, no one's quite sure when, the English word for it became pargeting. And it was very fashionable, probably, in Tudor times. But then there came the Commonwealth, and that sort of thing was out of fashion. Everything had to be very austere and very simple. So I expect a lot of it got knocked off. There's still a few farmhouses around with old Tudor pargeting on them. So there's this one here has got a stamped and combed, so it's stamped in with a piece of wood, I expect, and then jutted in with the ends of a comb, very randomly all over the surface, but in panels to make it look smart. And that's Tudor. And then this one here has got the comb is stamped into the surface in panels, but then there's some freehand modelling as well of a dragon and some flowers, and this is high up on a gable end. And so at some time, I suspect the front of the farmhouse must have looked very grand, because this is just on one not very visible side. The reason it survived is that fairly soon afterwards, an extension was added to the farmhouse. So this ornament was sort of trapped in the attic and is still there to this day. So, right, and then the Commonwealth came along and pargeting went out of fashion. There was no one doing it until the Restoration. And then it became back with a bang. It was the thing. And most of the old pargeting that you find is from this time. In East Anglia, there are lots of grand pargets and combed pargets that date back to 1650 to 1700-ish. It's very hard to date parget because it's just plaster. There's nothing in it that gives it a date. It's not like it's got tree rings or something. So usually you have to date it by reference to something that's next to it. Like this was done and then this window was put in. And so it must have been before that window was put in, that sort of thing. Sometimes it has dates on, which is very helpful if you can trust them. Yes, after 1700, it sort of fell out of fashion. The style became more neoclassical. Everyone wanted very much more formal frontages to their house, with a door in the middle and maybe windows each side, or maybe even 2 windows each side if you were grand. And sash windows came into fashion, and it all looked much more formal and simple and neoclassical. And if you had the money, then, you know, when it came renovation time, you either redid the front of your house in brick or completely rebuilt it in brick or stone. And even if you didn't do that, you plastered over with nice flat and rectangular with little dentilations in. And pargeting really went out of fashion. And that sort of stayed the way until late-ish Victorian time, when the arts and crafts movement came in. And the arts and crafts looked back to historical traditions, and the arts and crafts reinvented pargeting again. And I've done quite a bit of work in Essex, and it's really interesting to see. You get the really old Jacobean pargeting, and then you don't seem to get an awful lot until in 1880, 1890, it kicks it off into action again with arts and crafts pargeting, and it may have died out completely in between. It's not very clear, really. If it did die out completely, then that sort of makes sense, because the tools and the techniques that are used changed quite a lot. For the old parget, it was lime plaster, probably with chalk rather than sand if that was available, and it was combed and it was freehand modelled. The new arts and crafts parget was probably lime plaster still, because cement hadn't really come in at that time, but with sand instead of chalk. And the advantage of sand for the arts and crafts type work is it tends to be stamped. And if you stamp into a surface, you've got to release the stamp, and it releases much easier into sand than it does into chalk. So they tended to use the sand, which sort of made sense because most plastering around the country was done with sand rather than with chalk by that time. You still do see pargeting carrying on through the early 20th century, but it went into a bit of a lull until about 2000-ish, and then there was another surge of interest in pargeting, and quite a lot in East Anglia in particular. Quite a lot of local plasterers would do stamped work, and also there was people reinventing freehand modelling using lime plaster. So it sort of kicked off again. The disadvantage is that everyone who's been learning it in the last 20 years pretty much has had to teach themselves, because there is no course where you can go and do pargeting. So it means that people who do it are very rare on the ground, and at the moment there's only 5 or 6 people doing it, and only one who's any younger than me. So most of us are heading towards retirement, which is part of the reason why I set about doing these videos, because once we've retired and disappeared, that leaves one person to hold the fort for pargeting, and that's just not viable. And so people are going to have to teach themselves. So hopefully these videos will give you a little step up in learning, but you cannot do anything. You're going to have to practice and practice and try things out to see what suits you, because quite a lot of knowledge has got lost over the years, and I'm sure that I and the other pargeters who are working now don't know things that people in the past used to know. So there we go. If you want to go and look at pargeting, the best places to go are Suffolk and North Essex, because that's where most pargeting is. It's interesting as to why it's there. I think the reason is that in Jacobean times, when pargeting was very popular, they were rich parts of the country. There was a lot of money being made from the wool trade and from cattle, and your typical farmer was quite wealthy. They built themselves some beautiful timber-framed farmhouses and had them pargeted. So if you're in the middle of Suffolk, you're way out in the country. There's timber-framed farmhouses everywhere, and pretty much, I think, all of them would have been pargeted. And the same's true of North Essex, which was very similar in those times. When pargeting went out of fashion, Suffolk and North Essex were relatively poor, really. The Industrial Revolution didn't really come to Suffolk and North Essex. It was a rural backwater, and the farmers were poor. They couldn't afford to do any renovations to their house. They had a nice solid farmhouse they'd been living in for several hundred years. They weren't going to knock that down, but they weren't going to renovate it either. And so pargeting sort of hung on and stayed there in a way it didn't in other parts of the country, because you can still find pargeting all over the country, but not very much of it. In the last 20 years, there's been a revival in pargeting. You get stamped patterns into sand, lime and sand, or cement and sand, both are done. And a particular pattern that's become popular is to do a panel with 5 motifs in it. That's definitely an introduction of the last 20 years. Also, freehand pargeting has had a revival too, and a design that is much more frequent now than it used to be is a frieze, so a long band of parget between the upper windows and the lower windows.